Thanks for coming back to watch the final video description for my 2018 acrylic painting series on Brave New World. I am artist Ian Young. This video is being recorded in Topeka, Kansas on October 30th, 2018. It's technically Devil's Night for all you Halloween people out there. This is the 12th video on the 12th painting and final painting of the series, titled South by Southwest, the Mockumentary and the Electro Shredding of the Lighthouse Footage. John the Savage must stay on the mainland and runs off to a lighthouse where the masses won't find him for a while and the scandals surrounding him can quiet down. John is aggravated he doesn't get to go to an island like the Happy Watson or the Sad Bernard, and argues his case to World Controller Mustafa Mond, but loses. Mond is toying with the idea of continuing the experiment, but John tells Watson before running, "I'll be damned if I go on being experimented on." At first, everything goes as planned for John. Back in nature, with his training from the American Southwest desert, John can grow his own food, hunt his own game, and has taken enough supplies to last him through the winter. Surrounded by thick woods, bubbling streams, rolling green English hills, he has a whole new environment to explore like he's never seen in person until now. John was happier at this point, or is happier at this point, I should say, since he's been since leaving New Mexico. He builds his own weapons, makes his own clothes, and is far more pleased with solitary activities that require skill and patience rather than playing electromagnetic golf or attending the Feelies or socializing. After a while, though, John starts feeling guilty that he's happy. The horrible memory of how his mother Linda passed at the hospital for the dead and dying while the Delta twins laughed at her. At the same time, Mustafa Mond and Bernard Marx were following him around with their cameras for their televised experiments. It keeps haunting John and making John enraged and wanting John to seek revenge. He engages in what some call self-destructive behavior by making a whip, a physical whip, and using it upon himself on his back to purify his soul, like the natives whom raised John. In the book, a group of Delta Minus lawn workers spot the Savage and call the news. In the movie, Mond visits the Savage and tries to convince him to come back to London. John refuses, and Mond retaliates by sending the media. So there's a bit of a difference between how John gets to the lighthouse between the book and the movie. Either way, John engages in light BDSM sessions upon himself with the whip for various personal reasons. The narcotic effects that submissives tend to enjoy, the purifying of his soul per the Southwestern beliefs, and also perhaps to make a statement to Mustafa Mond and the lower case that pain isn't necessarily something to run from. Before sentencing, John points out that pain teaches, pain instructs, pain helps people mature and grow and get over their grief and become better people, but by avoiding it and covering it over with petty pleasures, they destroy their own ability to evolve, not realizing that society is encouraging the lower case to run from all of their problems on purpose because it's good for stability and not the lower case. Once the Delta Minus landscapers spot John hitting himself with the whip, they tell the local news crews, who tell the national news, and by the next day, John is back to being a celebrity again, with hordes and hordes of gawkers and rubberneckers camping outside the lighthouse and putting up tents and flying drones and filming him 24/7. John curses them in Zuni, but they won't go away. He threatens them with violence, but they won't go away. Eventually, he breaks one of their cameras and kicks one of them in the face, and even after a while goes so far as to start shooting arrows into the crowd. Once he starts shooting the arrows, of course, the paparazzi keep their distance, but helicopters still circle at least once a day. John thinks he's alone again, but he's really not. Darwin Bonaparte, pictured here, an acclaimed director, comedic director, who'd gotten his start as a big games photographer, has a hidden crew surrounding the lighthouse and filming the Savage at all hours. He's decided to make a mockumentary as the next undertaking of his comedic film career. In the movie, World Controller Mustafa Mond outright hires him and even kind of tells him to slander the Savage as they're in the studio. In the book, they don't go that far, but Mond obviously still allows it. The film crews peep in John's windows, intentionally sabotage his solitude for the sake of material, and ultimately make him miserable. Eventually, the film is released in feely palaces all across England and hyper-translated to the rest of Europe, shining more light on John than even before he first arrived. Only this time around, he's not portrayed as a charming, handsome curiosity, but a moronic, ridiculous court jester. The lighthouse becomes a media sensation yet again, but with police protection upon orders from the state to assist the starstruck fans without fear of arrows flying at them. Upon sunset after opening night, the crowd grows to its largest ever, and John comes out of the lighthouse to fight them off as usual. They chant louder than ever, "We want the whip, we want the whip," in reference to the whip that he's been hitting himself in the back with. As the crowd yells, John spots Lenina there out of the corner of his eye, who he hasn't seen since the assault in her apartment at the end of painting number 8. The Savage's yearning for a female figure in his life has only grown worse since the passing of his mother at the hospital for the dead and dying, and he longs to have another chance with Lenina, as she does him. But the crowd gets louder. "We want the whip, we want the whip," in a very uncharacteristic move for a beta minus. Lenina sticks out her hands at John in yearning and actually sheds a tear, which she's never done before, and asks inaudible questions John can't hear, over the chanting, "We want the whip, we want the whip, we want the whip." John, frustrated at not being able to hear Lenina's words or make out what she's saying, accepts the crowd's challenge, somewhat similar to the snake dances he was never allowed to participate in by his elders on the reservation, ironically, and beats himself repeatedly, drawing blood. As they continue egging him on, it gets worse, and they continue egging him on some more, and he's beat himself to the point where he actually kind of hopes he will die. That's how sick of all of it he is. Expecting this reaction, mockumentary director Darwin Bonaparte, with assistance from the state thanks to Mustafa Mond, have the police release mass quantities of an invisible superdrug gas upon the Savage, and he's so caught up in beating himself senseless that by the time he realizes he's under the influence of this gas, it's too late. More superdrugs are sprayed on him, many of which are aphrodisiac as well as hypnotic and hallucinogenic and euphoric and all the rest. The crew sends all the girls obsessed with his celebrity status who have wanted to engage him the whole time they've been camped out at the lighthouse, running at John. And John, forgetting all his morals, has a night-long super high around the world with all of them. The crews actually film the entire thing. As we discussed earlier in the videos, pornography is no longer stigmatized. John is technically in public and is squatting in an abandoned lighthouse, so he doesn't really have a whole lot of rights. While he's passed out, the footage of the event circulates, not just nationally, but internationally. And Darwin Bonaparte starts discussing using the footage for another mockumentary sequel. Upon waking the morning after, John sobers up, and it dawns on him what happened. He's shown the mobile phone footage of his own naked body fornicating with woman after woman while the crowd eggs him on before starting up an orgy of their own, which John kind of incited. John is aghast at his own actions and humiliated and sick that it was all recorded and globally broadcast. And for all we know, I mean, John could still be a virgin. Regardless of whether he was or wasn't, it was well known before this happened that he was superstitious enough to harm himself before the orgy. And as someone who was capable of doing that before being completely slandered on a mass social media scale across the globe, obviously he's still prone to doing that afterwards. And as a result, John ultimately hangs himself here. The novel ends with the line south, southwest, south, southeast, east, in reference to the direction his body is swaying. I titled this final painting South by Southwest in reference to the opening words of the final sentence in the book. I think Huxley wrote these words to represent the John's final hopes of returning to New Mexico and his youthful innocence upon dying. Southwest, which starts the sentence, before the corpse swings back around in the direction of London, the city that ultimately leads to his own self-inflicted demise, east. So to end the Brave New World novel, written in 1932, that has as its main subject matter sexual orgies, reproductive control by the government, hard drug abuse, cloning, indentured servitude, and death appreciation ceremonies for children, Huxley also throws suicide into the mix on the final page, which, depending on who you ask, might be the most disturbing of all these subject matters. The book was banned more for sexual content and the idea that the government could dictate who gets pregnant and who gets to be a parent and who doesn't. But in my opinion, as somebody who's really never wanted his own children, suicide is a far harder subject for me to discuss. So I'm going to keep the explanation of number 12 quick and to the point. Author Aldous Huxley gives no explanation for John's act afterwards. No resolution, no epilogue, no note. We're left to reread everything that happens up until the final page and interpret what led up to it in our own way without ever knowing the real answers, just like a real suicide. Here's the projection screen in the middle of the painting, sort of symbolic of the mockumentary that Darwin Bonaparte made. In a small, surreal outdoor feely palace where lines and lines of people are walking single file to take their seats. This time around, of course, instead of a mockumentary on the screen, it's a Kachina doll hanging in effigy representing John's response. There are a couple movie posters advertising the mockumentary. This is the savage here, hanging in death, and here in the lower center is world controller Mustafa Mond.